Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is just my stupid opinion. Today, I thought I'd bring you just a stupid update. It seems that recently, President Trump has decided to scrap the Iran nuclear deal that was signed by President Obama back in 2015. This deal was one of Obama's legacies, along with the Affordable Health Care Plan. These were supposed to be two things that Obama left that was supposed to define him as the president of his time. And Trump seems to, since he got in office, he seems pretty dedicated at trying to dismantle Obama's legacy at anywhere possible. But this is something that Trump has been targeting right from the get-go. Back when he was still campaigning, this was another thing that he said that he was going to do when he came into power. So if anything, you could just see it as Trump fulfilling another campaign promise. So relations with Iran and the US have always been strained. I don't think there's ever been a good time in history. So this deal, at least viewed by some people on the left, was seen as a positive thing because this would help work towards perhaps, in a sense, sort of disarmament between the two sides. Maybe we could start seeing a more peaceful agreement between the two. However, while many people on the left held this sentiment, the right had a very different feeling about it. Republicans were very upset with the signing of this deal when it happened, and in fact, soon after the deal was struck, a group of Republicans put together a letter to the Iranian government and they all signed it, where they said that the deal was only ratified by President Obama but was not shared by the whole House, and that if a Republican president was to come in, this deal could be taken down and they would actually push for it to be taken down. When you have your leader that has signed an agreement with another country, and then you go around their back to say that to the other country that you will not fulfill your end of the bargain if you get the opportunity to, it does not look good on you. In fact, if this had been done by President Trump and the Democrats had done that, all the MAGA people would be screaming about how treasonous the left truly is. So I don't know if I'd actually say treason as in the legal sense. They were treacherous to their country, but it's definitely underhanded and a backstabbing move against your leader. And it just shows the division inside of your country if you are to do that. If Democrats do that now, it just proves how they're not standing behind President Trump. This is exactly what happened when the Republicans sent that letter to the Iranian government stating they will not agree to these terms should a Republican president come into power, which is exactly what happened. So the point of this deal was, it's pretty obvious, they were trying to curb the chance of Iran getting their hands on a nuclear weapon and putting themselves in a much stronger position if ever they had to go up against the United States. So what did this deal do? Well, the main effort of the deal was to try and curb the radioactive materials that are used in order to make a bomb. See, you have two possible fuels that you can use for a bomb. You have uranium and plutonium. Uranium is turned into the fuel for the bomb when the uranium ore is put through an enrichment program. They are run through some centrifuges, which separates the U-235. U-235 is an isotope which is used as the fuel. And once they can extract enough of it, the uranium has been enriched to use for the bomb. Now, plutonium has a similar process, only it's put through a reactor. And this ends up, the isotope that gets separated is Pu-239. But the result is the same, is that it is turned into a fuel which is capable of being tipped on a nuclear warhead. Now, in terms of uranium, for most of the ore that's available, less than 1% of it is made up of U-235 on its own. So this is what the enrichment process does. The enrichment process allows you to extract as much percentage of the U-235 as possible. Now, bomb grade uranium usually has about 90% enrichment. But by the time this deal was struck, the Iranians were starting to process their uranium at 20% enrichment. So they were starting to move their way up. And to put it into perspective, the power in these bombs, a standard Western reactor for uranium only has a 5% enriched uranium. And think about how much power a reactor can give you across the continent. Each reactor can supply a shit ton of power, and that's only a 5% enrichment. So, what did this agreement do? Well, in terms of the Iranian side, it would control their access to the nuclear materials. For instance, the Fordo plant was used in order to enrich uranium, but under the terms of this agreement, the plant is now being transformed into a science center. As well, another plant, the Natanz plant, has been forced to cut back on its production. It used to run at least 10,000 centrifuges, but now it's only being run at 5,000. So the US government has not stopped the Iranians from enriching uranium, but they have regulated how much uranium can be enriched by the Iranians. They've limited the enrichment process to only 3.7%, and they've also put a cap on the stockpile of enriched uranium at 300 kilograms or 660 pounds. And this will take effect for the next 15 years, so under when this agreement was signed, it would expire in 2030. And the reason for this part of the agreement is because the US government said that with this amount of uranium being produced, it would be insufficient for the Iranian government if they were trying to make a bomb rush, trying to create as many nuclear warheads as possible in a short amount of time. And definitely it would. In terms of plutonium, there was a heavy water nuclear reactor plant that was being built in Arak, and it has been scheduled for redesign and rebuilding. This would include no weapons grade plutonium. Its original reactor core was removed in terms of this agreement, but it has remained in the country. This reactor could produce the Pu-239 used in plutonium nuclear warheads. The spent reactor fuel for the Arak facility was shipped out of the country, and no new reactors are allowed for the next 15 years. This agreement also guarantees that the greater access to Iranian facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And just to shorten everything, from here on out, you're going to hear me refer to them as the IAEA, just for, sake of brevity. And what the IAEA has been allowed due to this agreement is access to inspect any suspicious sites on Iranian soil. They have access to the supply chains of uranium and plutonium so they can see how much is being manufactured and where it's being sent. They have constant surveillance of the centrifuge facilities. They have limited the low enrichment uranium stockpiles by 98%, which will be done over the next 15 years, so by 2030. And they will also limit enriched abilities and research over the next 15 years. And also, on top of this, there are some transparency measures which will be actually remain in place for the next 25 years, so those won't expire until 2040. So on the other side of this agreement, it was signed on by 6 nations. We have the US, the UK, Russia, France, China, and Germany. Of course, America led the way on this negotiation. And in exchange for the Iranian government complying with these agreements, these 6 nations have agreed to lift sanctions against them, which has been crippling the Iranian economy over the last decade. It has cost the country more than $160 billion in oil revenues, and that's just from 2012 to 2016. It has allowed Iran to once again trade oil on the global market. And as well, at least from America, over $100 billion in frozen assets were released to the Iranians. The European Union agreed to roll back their energy and banking sanctions. The UN annulled their sanctions against Iran, and these were a number of different sanctions that were passed between 2006 and 2015. And they included bans on ballistic missile, travel bans, and freezing Iranian funds. So many see this agreement as being quite necessary because they say that the agreement was if we did not come to an agreement, there were three possible options that could be taken by these nations, mainly by America, but by the six nations named. And it was that they could kill the deal, but that would mean next to no restrictions on nuclear warheads with Iran. And nobody on the right would want that, so there's no way about killing that deal just and then letting it go. They could once again increase sanctions and hope that Iran would cave into their demands. It hadn't happened so far, so I don't know if there was a reason that they would this time, and it wouldn't curb their ability to actually go after nuclear weapons. In fact, in many ways, it probably encouraged them to actually keep on trying to make the bomb. And finally, would be the possibility of war. Without an agreement, if Iran was continuously going for a nuclear bomb, and they don't have a good relationship with America and the rest of the West, then war would seem like a likely possibility in order to prevent them. However, this would undoubtedly spark a regional war, and the Middle East would fall apart even more than it is right now. And this is another thing that probably just would have encouraged Iran to keep searching for the bomb. Because if you're getting invaded by the most powerful military in the world, what else can you do? But what is it about this deal that the Republicans didn't like, to the point where they were prepared to send a message to the other side and tell them they will not honor the contract? Well, you have to look into the history of Iran. You can't just take it at face value, which many people on the left will. This deal did a good job at least slowing Iran, but it didn't stop Iran. And this is one of the main problems that people on the right seem to have with it, is they wanted an end to the program. They wanted no possibility of a nuclear bomb being created, rather than the possibility of it just taking longer. But this is because Iran is one of the leading sponsors of global terrorism. As a nation, they sponsor so many organizations that it just causes a lot of shit. They have a history of lying and breaking previous treaties, both with America and other European countries, Western countries. And many people are not happy with their involvement in Syria on the Republican side. America has supported the Syrian rebels, and while Iran has supported the current regime in power, al-Assad. And many see this as Iran being responsible to leading to the rise of ISIS, or at least playing their part to allow ISIS to come to power. And actually, let me make a quick clarification. America used to support the Syrian rebels, but a few months ago, I believe, they pulled their financial support from them. Another reason is Iran has already broken aspects of the treaty. One of the big ones that they broke is, as I already mentioned, the IAEA has access to Iranian facilities in order to test them and check and see if Iran is indeed enriching their uranium or their plutonium. Well, by September of 2016, it was reported that Iran had begun inspecting their own facilities. Essentially, they were getting their own samples and they were sending them off to the IAEA in order to be tested. But the fact there were no members of the IAEA present on site meant that Iran really could have gotten those samples. Well, from anywhere they could have pulled a clean sample, I suppose. Maybe there is testing to show that it's related back to that facility. But at the very least, they can hide any evidence of them trying to enrich plutonium or trying to enrich more plutonium, uranium, whichever one. And one of the big things is the right sees this as a violation of them collecting their own samples, while people on the left tend to see this as cooperation. See, people on the left see it, this is actually even stated by President Obama at the time, but the left sees this as Iran complying and wanting to, work in order to make this agreement work. But I feel like, at least from my perspective, that there would be more cooperation by allowing outside agencies to come on to your soil and check for themselves, rather than you doing some of the checking and sending it off to them. And the right sees it as a violation because they're not supposed to check their own samples. Now, the IAEA did state that they were satisfied with the samples that they have been provided, that they think they are legitimate and safe, that they're good enough to take at face value. But in the past, we have had indications of sanitization at nuclear sites before testing was done by the IAEA, which might indicate that there was enrichment going on at these plants when they weren't supposed to, or that they're enriching more uranium than they're supposed to, or to a higher concentration. It just shows that there might be some cover-up of some kind. And with Iran's past, I think it's a good possibility that, in fact, they are trying to hide something. Another thing that is definitely worth noting is Hassan Rouhani is the current president of Iran, but back in 2013, he was just a presidential candidate, and he claimed that when he was Iran's nuclear negotiator, Iran ignored IAEA agreements for the suspension of nuclear enrichment. And he bragged about this, and then 3 weeks later ended up getting elected to the presidency. He bragged about it in open public, so this didn't seem to concern the citizens. Another reason Republicans were so upset was the fact that Obama didn't adopt their red line. Their red line was the full stop to any manufacturing, any enrichment of uranium or possible continental ballistic weapons tipped with nuclear warheads. But Obama, essentially what he did was slow the production down, then stop it. So this was the red line that the Republicans wanted, that Obama refused to adopt. Now, the rebuttal to this is that Obama never agreed to end enrichment, but only to slow it down. In fact, before talks even started, Obama enraged the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu by not agreeing to these red lines. Another thing that the right seems to have a problem with in terms of this agreement is that the IAEA has been wrong before. And a good example of this is actually one report that they made on Iran. It reported Iran conducted no nuclear research after December 2009. This was a report that came out in December 2015. However, the website Iran Watch reported quite differently. So this article from Iran Watch reported that by the end of 2007, Iran had commenced feeding uranium hexafluoride gas into approximately 3,000 centrifuges it had installed in its site in Natanz. All were of the IR-1 variety. The number of these centrifuges then rose steadily. By late 2008, Iran had installed almost 5,000 centrifuges, and by August 2015, Iran had installed almost 15,000 centrifuges and was feeding gas into more than 9,000 of them. In February 2013, Iran began installing a more advanced centrifuge model at Natanz, referred to as the IR-2M. By August 2015, 1,008 IR-2M centrifuges had been installed, though none had been fed with uranium gas. During the same period, Iran made great strides in producing uranium hexafluoride at its uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. From March 2004 through February 2008, Iran produced a total of 371 tons of this material. But there were aspects to this treaty that I don't really think anybody could have understood. One thing that Obama did is he moved 116 metric tons, so that's 130 imperial tons, of natural uranium near the end of his time in office. This was within the last few months. He said it was to compensate the removal of tons of reactor coolant, but he also made a similar move during negotiations when he sent a similar amount of uranium ore in 2015, and this was part of the negotiations. Another way Iran has not been really complying with the treaty is that since it's been installed, at least 2 more nuclear plants have been created. The other thing about this was that this was known and okayed by Obama. He didn't seem to have much of a problem with them building a couple more reactors. But considering how we're trying to prevent them from producing enriched uranium and plutonium, more reactors are not a good idea from our side. Some of the arguments also include that by only allowing Iran to enrich a small amount, it could allow Iran to get access to much simpler nuclear warheads. So they won't have the firepower of what America can pack. But a nuclear warhead is a nuclear warhead. Republicans just don't trust Iran. For Iran's history, as well as its overall behavior and hostility towards Israeli and American values, they don't trust them and they don't want to have anything to do with them, business-wise. And I suspect most were in favor of increased sanctions over a war, because a war not only would have destabilized the Middle East significantly more, but it also would have resulted in thousands of casualties on both sides. The left tends to look on this treaty a little bit differently, though. And I think that's because the left saw it as prioritization. I think the left looked at the options that were available, and they felt that this was the lesser of all the evils. We could go to war, renew sanctions, which might not do much, or no sanctions at all. Or negotiate so that way we can regulate their supply and control over their uranium and plutonium. Another reason for this, which a lot of times isn't mentioned, is that China and Russia support is required for this agreement, and both sides support the Syrian government and Bashar al-Assad. And should America have a bad relationship with Iran, considering Iran's ties to the Middle East and Russia and China's ties to the Middle East, they were probably trying to make sure that they signed on for this agreement more than anything. Also, many on the left have compared this to during World War II when President Roosevelt sided with Stalin over Hitler. And then they also compare it to maybe when Nixon reached out to China for support against the USSR during the Cold War. Also, I believe that through this, the Democrats were looking to control Iran, but considering how Iran is the strongest power in that area, or at least one of the strongest powers, I think they're trying to reform the Middle East through Iran. That if they could control Iran and maybe start influencing them with some American values, that maybe Iran then could influence that across the Middle East. I think this is a little bit of a dreamer's perspective, though, because there's a lot of shit history between America and Iran, so I don't know if this actually would have been something that could have gone through. But in the end, Republicans and the right were looking to control But in the end, Republicans and the right were looking to end Iran's nuclear program altogether, while the Democrats and the left were looking to slow and regulate their program, most likely seeing as ending their program as unlikely, so they went for the next best thing in their view. So what exactly does Trump want to do in terms of this agreement? Well, according to this article, U.S. President Donald Trump has condemned Iran as a fanatical regime and refused to continue signing off on a landmark international nuclear deal. In a combative speech on Friday, October 13th, Mr. Trump accused Iran of sponsoring terrorism and proposed new sanctions. He said Iran had already violated the 2015 deal, which imposed curbs on Iran's nuclear capabilities in return for easing international embargoes. International observers say Iran has been in full compliance with the deal. Speaking at the White House, Mr. Trump said he had been acting in order to deny Iran, quote, all paths to nuclear weapons. We will not continue down a path whose predictable conclusion is more violence, more terror, and the very real threat of Iran's nuclear breakout, he said. What does Trump's refusal to sign mean? Congress requires the U.S. president to certify every 90 days that Iran is upholding its part of the agreement. Mr. Trump has already recertified twice, but refuses to sign a third time ahead of a Sunday deadline. Congress now has 60 days to decide whether to pull out of the nuclear deal by reimposing sanctions. Some advocates of the deal, signed between Iran and 6 international powers, the UK, US, Russia, France, Germany, China, had feared that Mr. Trump would withdraw the US entirely. Instead, he essentially passed the ball to Congress, which would now decide whether to rewrite the framework in accordance with Trump's wishes. The president made it clear that if it did not, he would cancel the deal. Mr. Trump is seeking the end to the nuclear deal's so-called sunset clause, one of which allows the lifting of restrictions on Iran's nuclear enrichment program after 2025. He also called for new sanctions on Iran's elite revolutionary guard, which he called the, quote, corrupt personal terror force of Iran's leader, end quote, and restriction on Iran's ballistic missile program, which is not covered by the deal. Last month, Iran said it had successfully tested a new medium-range missile with a 2,000-kilometer range. The test was not internationally verified. The president said that congressional leaders were already drafting amendments that could curb the ballistic missile development and eliminate expiry dates on restrictions to Iran's nuclear development. So there you go. That's what you need to know right now. What's the agreement? What do people hate about the agreement? And what is going to happen? Looks like we just got to sit back, wait for Congress to work, which could take forever, and wait for them to reveal what are they going to do. Well, they got 60 days. They better act quick. Thank you very much. I'm Adrian Lloyd. This is Just My Stupid Opinion. I'll see you soon.